So, welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 73. And today we're going to talk about Led Zeppelin's Swan Song, their final release, which was Coda, which came out in 1982 on the Swan Song label. This is not the original release, which I did own at one point, but I then ceased to own, and now I own this one instead, which is part of the 2014-2015 reissue series that Jimmy Page indulged in. And I have to say, this has truly amazing sound, so that knob twiddling and re-releasing, as exploitative of fans as it may have been, certainly in terms of sound quality, well worth it. This is, and I say this as an extraordinarily long-time committed Zeppelin fan, the last of their albums that you should pick up. Certainly the last of their official releases that you should ever pick up. The 2015 update adds a whole bunch of stuff of genuine interest and in many cases genuine merit, but this is an album for confirmed fans. If you're not that, I would start almost anywhere else in their official catalog. So this particular release includes the original 1982 LP, which was a single LP, and two other LPs, both of which are what they're called companion discs, but they basically are a whole bunch of other rummaging. The overall quality of the material on this release is a notch up from 1982 because some of the extras are actually pretty cool. So a kind of What's Left in the Vaults compilation album from Zeppelin kind of provokes one to think about the history of the band. And there really are two very significant phases. The period from 1968 through the summer of 1975, when almost nothing went wrong for the band. They rose to the top of the album charts, they sold millions and millions of records, they broke attendance records, they toured widely, they basically owned the rock world by about 1970 until 1975. And then the period from 1975 to 1980 where almost nothing goes right. In the fall of 75, there is a car accident involving Robert Plant and his family. Their next album, Presence, is recorded with Robert not able to stand for a lot of it. There are also issues with the refueling and substance consumption habits of Jimmy Page and John Bonham. Jimmy's starting to use heroin. John Bonham is drinking more and more heavily. And there's a certain lethargy I think you can hear on Presence. By the time you get into The Outdoor, which is their last studio album, Page is really zoning in and out. Bonham is drinking extremely heavily, and that album really is a John Paul Jones and Robert Plant effort, with Bonham and Page essentially showing up to do their bits, but not, and certainly in Page's case, not driving forward with his vision of the band as had been the case a decade earlier. So the recorded output isn't going so well, but that's okay, they were always a touring band, right? So, they had left off in 1975 with a triumphant five-night stand at Earl's Court in London, where they basically reconquered their homeland, absolutely on top of the world. And incidentally, those videos and recordings of those Earl's Court nights are really something to be listened to and something to be prized if you can get your hands on bootlegs of those. And it's funny they've never been released officially. But their 1977 tour went from bad to worse to absolutely tragic. It was delayed due to sickness. There was a lot of tension and negativity in general, associated, I suspect, largely the fact that you've got two pretty heavy substance abusers who are part of the band. That's not going to play out well. There are a couple of violent incidents that happen. There's threatened legal proceedings, and then of course, putting all of that into much more minor perspective, terribly, Robert Plant's 5-year-old son gets a stomach virus and dies suddenly. The rest of the tour is canceled. Robert flies home, and obviously is devastated, and the band is moribund then for a little while. And even though they did get back in the studio, as I mentioned, for Into the Outdoor, never really got their mojo back. They did attempt to pull their socks up. They did the Nebworth concerts to general acclaim in 1979. Start to get serious, roll their sleeves up, do a tour in 1980 in Europe. But whatever revival that was going to turn out to be, we'll never know, because Bonham, of course, dies in September of 1980, and that is that. So I mention all that because Page pulls this together in 81, 82, but he's pretty messed up. He's messed up because of Bonham's death, and he's also messed up because he's still trying to kick the smack, as far as I understand it. And truly, and this was actually noted in reviews at the time, you had to wonder, is this really all there is in the vaults for this band that's produced so much amazing material? Was this really the best they could do? A lot of those problems are resolved by the 2015 reissue, by which point Jimmy had transformed himself from a smack refugee in the early 1980s and essentially carrying some trauma at the time too, to somebody who has really spent much of the last decade or so as a focused archivist of his greatest achievement, which was this band between 1968 and 1975. So let's talk about the original album first. So it starts with We're Gonna Groove, which is a song by Benny King. It is actually a recording of one of the songs that they performed at the Royal Albert Hall in January 1970. It wasn't billed as such in the original coda, but that in fact is the case. There is a second guitar, at least one of the guitar, overdubbed by Jimmy, I think to actually pretty good effect. One of the 2 or 3 really pretty good songs on the first LP. Followed by Poor Tom, which was from the Led Zeppelin 3 sessions. I always feel with Led Zeppelin 3, which I've reviewed earlier, that it is just a song or two away from being perhaps the best rock album ever released. And this one is a song which could easily have replaced Hats Off to Roy Harper and made Led Zeppelin 3 an infinitely better album. But they didn't. But it's a great tune. It's very heavy on Bonham's drumming and Plant's singing for the most part, and harmonica playing. Really kind of a fun tune, quite distinct from anything else they ever did. So it's disappointing it never got an official release until '82. Then I Can't Quit You Baby, which is also from the Albert Hall concert, misbilled on the original release, but accurately credited to that concert this time out. And then the final song on side 1 is Walter's Walk. That's a song which is actually from the Houses of the Holy sessions. I think it's a pretty good song. They actually played this not super often, but occasionally in their live concerts, 72, 73, in around that point. I can see why it didn't make the album. It isn't necessarily as strong as some of the other cuts on that record, but it's still a pretty good song, I think. So you've got a pretty strong album side 1 to the original LP. Side 2, I really don't think is nearly as strong. It starts with a couple of tunes from the Into the Outdoor sessions, Ozone Baby and Darlene, which, you know, are okay. I think they're clearly Zeppelin tunes. As I say, there's a certain level of quality there. But this is kind of from the point where they had lost their mojo. And I don't know that if they were putting out albums of this quality from the beginning, whether they would have had nearly the profile or success that they did originally. This is kind of Zeppelin filler, basically. Then there's an extended and heavily electronically treated drum solo by John Bonham, which is interesting to listen to, but I don't know that you're going to go back and listen to it more than once. The last song on the original LP is Wearing and Tearing. So now, the punks have been criticizing Zeppelin for being, you know, boring old farts and being grandiose and full of themselves and so on. You know, perhaps a grain of truth in all that. This is supposedly their response to the punks. It's not a very good response. It's soaked in reverb. It is probably the most ponderous, fast rock tune ever released, I think. And it has a very unconvincing Plant vocal. I would say probably his least appealing singing performance in his Zeppelin career anyway. I also think it says something about how thin the skin of this band was, that despite having ruled rock and roll, really, for a decade, from 68 to 78, they felt it necessary to respond to a bunch of, you know, offhand comments by a bunch of guys who had bands together for 6 months or so. Pretty sad to do that, and then I think to fail so miserably. So you can see why this was never actually properly released, and I'm not sure why Jimmy felt he needed to drag this one out, but there it is. So now let's talk about the material on the 2 additional LPs that accompanied the 2015 re-release. And I think there's basically 2 categories here. The first category are a few songs which are basically very minor updates or altered versions of songs which were either on the original Coda LP or were otherwise released earlier, but which basically don't deviate that much from the original release. My response to all those is meh. The second category are genuinely distinct and different pieces from the vaults, which are actually of significant interest. So there are 2, first of all, from Led Zeppelin 1, from those recording sessions. And they are Sugar Mama, which is kind of a inane but fun I don't know what you call it, I guess kind of a blues workout. You can see why it didn't make the album, but it's kind of fun. And the other one is Baby Come On Home. Now this one is kind of a gospel-y number. They never did a song like this again. Probably the reason it never made the original album is this is basically a musical dead end. They were never going to go down the gospel route again. Next one I want to mention is Traveling Riverside Blues, which comes from the series of recordings they did for the BBC in the late 60s and early 70s, almost all of which were anthologized in an official release in 1997. Anyway, here it is again. It's a great tune. I think it's fantastic and probably would have been worthy of an official release, I think, at some point. Then there's a song from the Led Zeppelin 2 sessions, which of course took place in various recording studios while they were on tour in 1969 all across North America. And it's Bring It On Home. It doesn't have the, to my ears anyway, slightly grating intro from Robert Plant where he does that kind of faux African-American singing. So to me, actually, this is a more interesting, frankly, better version than the one that occurs on the original album. There are two from the Led Zeppelin 3 sessions, including Hey Hey What Can I Do? Now this is a song that really ought to have made that record, and hats off to Roy Harper, be excised. And it was fiendishly hard to find for the longest time, but it's nice that it's been anthologized here. And then a song which most folks will not have heard, which is St. Tristan's Sword, which is an instrumental, a fantastic tune, just lacking the vocals. And had there been vocals attached, this had potential to be, one of the great songs in their catalog. As it is, it's a really great instrumental, but that's all it is. Then there are two songs from a little episode after they had toured Japan in 1972. Page and Plant went to Bombay. They recorded with a bunch of classical Indian musicians through a connection of Ravi Shankar's. They recorded Four Sticks and Friends. Really interesting versions, actually, I have to say. Another little tidbit from this is that during this particular period of time, while they were in Bombay, Page and Plant went to a little nightclub called the Slip Disc and did an impromptu concert. There was a bit of a write-up in a local magazine on this, which you can see here. Anyway, kind of fun, bit of detail. And then finally, there are two outtakes from the Physical Graffiti sessions, which are versions of the Wanton Song and In the Light. The version of the Wanton Song basically sounds like a live take for the band in the studio. I actually really enjoyed this. This was great. Everybody Makes It Through, which is In the Light, really quite a different arrangement of the song. The original version has quite a spooky intro. This one is even spookier. It's got a harpsichord with a kind of a creepy Plant vocal, which I have to say I kind of like. So, what to say about this reissue of Coda? Well, I guess my comments I'm going to divide into talking about the original LP and then the companion discs. The original LP for me was kind of a strange episode in scraping the barrel, and given the additional material which we have subsequently learned was available, just kind of a poor effort. And I can't give that part, that is to say the original Coda LP, any more than 3 out of 5. I will say, however, that the new material is pretty interesting, and there are several pretty cool songs which are either very difficult to find in any other version, or in a couple of cases were never released until here. So this whole package I would give a 4 out of 5.